So the original plan was not to have the driver shoot the president.
Of course not. The original plan is to have the driver drive slow during the kill zone. Kennedy gets hit in the head, gets brought to the hospital. He comes in on the level. They slap a mask on his face. I'm a diabetic. I know what it is to have a breathing mask. I use it every night. Connect him to a respirator. Oh, we're trying to, save him. Press the button, go up to the OR on 4th floor or 5th, whatever it is. And then you have the craniotomy, the hospital craniotomy. That's not a pathological craniotomy, it's a clinical craniotomy. We're talking about an ordinary neurosurgery. And then this announcement is made, well, we're sorry, he died in surgery. And the world would know that Kennedy died in surgery. Okay? Then the body, having had the bullets removed and having had the wounds altered, and it's not a big a deal, okay, goes down to, now you press G. As Sean Federer said, you go up to the 4th floor for your operation. Now he's pronounced dead. Now you go down to G, which is the basement, you go to pathology. You turn it over to the forensic pathologist for an autopsy. He does the autopsy, and he says, well, President Kennedy was shot twice from behind. Here's the draft of the autopsy report. Bobby is flown in from Washington to accompany his sister and the body back. Here's a preliminary draft of the autopsy. And by the way, Oswald was your agent. Have a nice life and go screw yourself. I mean, that's what this is all about. That's the way it was supposed to unfold.
So
but it didn't.
So the original plan was to have the shooters in the front,
a couple of shooters,
to set up Oswald as the assassin from behind,
right?
And included in the original plan was to have JFK's body taken up to surgery. That's where they were going to remove the bullets.
Right.
But that didn't happen because Connolly was shot.
Correct.
And
there's an agent who was shot.
And there was
the
an
car
agent
comes
that
in
shot.
with 2 unexpected victims. You got a body to be hidden. The agent is shot, and you got Connolly. And here's the great irony: we are now at the 50th anniversary of the assassination. One of my discoveries that I made, that I am sure proves that I am correct about this, is that the Dallas Morning News, the day after the assassination, the first edition of the Morning News, says that President Kennedy died in surgery in a 6th floor operating room. I love that story. And there's a second story, that the president was being moved to surgery. This is in the 11/23/63 Dallas Morning News. And I got it on microfilm, and I put it in my records, and I'm getting it ready so when my book is finally written on this thing I call Godzilla, I have it ready. Well, guess what? Because of the 50th anniversary, they've reprinted that edition of the Dallas Morning News. It's all over Dallas. You can buy a copy for $3. Somebody mailed one of them to me. There's the story that Kennedy died in surgery, and no one has noticed it or knows what it means. And it's circulating all over Dallas as we speak. A story that people probably say, oh, well, it didn't happen that way. I guess some reporter made a mistake. Hell no. That was the official story that was going to go out, that was printed by accident, even though the event hadn't occurred. And now it's been reprinted on the 50th anniversary, and there's thousands of copies circulating around Dallas.
How ironic.
Yeah, that's great. I just love that part of it.
So all the pre-planning resulted in the assassination not going the way they had wanted it to go. There were a number of problems, as you pointed out. Tell us a little bit about that. You believe that Kennedy was supposed to be transported to an ambulance along the way and then taken to Parkland Hospital.
Yes, yes, this is really a good point. Back when I first came up with these discoveries about the idea that there was going to be surgery on the body at Parkland Hospital, they're going to delay the pronouncement of death, pretend he's alive when he's dead, and well, when I was first researching all this is back in the 70s, and I was researching all this, I had the Dallas police radio tapes from Mary Farrell, the legendary Dallas researcher. And I had my headset on, I was a ham radio operator, I was making my transcripts and well, there were these transmissions on one of the channels. Clear the way for the ambulance going to Parkland Hospital. This is after the assassination. And then some officers say, well, what's this about? What ambulance? Well, the ambulance carrying the president. And so, well, there's no ambulance here carrying the president. This is another event that didn't happen that was supposed to happen. So then I get more evidence that the Parkland Hospital operator is notified by the Dallas Police Department that the president is arriving by ambulance. So there was a plan to transfer President Kennedy. The car comes out of Dealey Plaza and starts going up Stemmons Streetway and passes in front of the Trade Mart where he was supposed to speak. There was a plan to have the car swerve over and transfer him to an ambulance to get him away from his wife and aides. Because this is all about controlling the body. Once he's dead, first you got to shoot him to make him dead. Secondly, then you got to get control of his body and bring him to where you want to bring him, to the operating room, whatever. They want to get him away from Jackie, away from O'Donnell, away from all those people. So they were going to transfer him to an ambulance. And what's great about this ambulance transfer hypothesis, it's not a hypothesis, is that before the assassination, minutes before, there's other radio transmissions in which the police captain in charge of the Dallas Trade Mart is radioing to the deputy police chief, Stevenson, of the Dallas Police Department. Tell Stevenson, they use numbers, I'm just using his name here. I forget his name. I'm not sure the name of the guy at the captain, I think it's Talbot, but I'm not sure. Tell Stevenson the ambulances have arrived. The ambulances have arrived. Okay, Stevenson has now been told the ambulances have arrived. So there's this whole business of setting up for the ambulances as if, well, anyway, that's part of the setup. So they put the ambulances there, and then after the shooting, the dispatcher doesn't know that the transfer hasn't taken place. And I think he's probably part of the plot, the Dallas police dispatcher, which would make a lot of sense, by the way, because he's a central figure. He's the communications center. Anyway, so he's making these transmissions, clear the way for the ambulance going to the hospital. I mean, if I were a special prosecutor, he would be a person of interest, to put it mildly. I mean, you'd get him in a room before a grand jury, and you basically say, you want to go to jail? Tell me what you know about this whole thing. And that's the way you solved the Kennedy assassination decades ago. But of course, you can't do that, because if you say there's a conspiracy in this country, they think you're nuts. I'm lucky to have gotten this stuff published. But, yeah, he was supposed to be transferred to an ambulance, and they did not. So the ambulance transfer is an integral part. And what's really interesting is that the Dallas police tapes, which I personally believe have been altered, and I'll tell you why in a minute, the Dallas police tapes, they left that on it. Now, maybe the person doing the alteration wasn't that smart. I don't know. There's a lot of, you got to account for human ignorance. But by the way, 4 or 5 or 6, I think I have 7 witnesses who say that the first thing out of the mouth of, in the lead car right in front of the president, and he's involved in the plot too, was surround the building. That's the building.
How would they have known?
Yeah, how would he know? Surround the building. Well, there's no such surround the building transmission on the radio tape. But Chief Curry is such a dope that he was proud of his transmission. And in December, he writes this report to the city manager. The first thing I did was I said, surround the building. I mean, what a schmuck. I mean, the guy said, surround the building. It's not on the tape. And there's a reporter in Dallas who hears it, and he was on the radio that afternoon. And the first thing I heard was Chief Curry said, surround the building. Well, surround the building is not on the radio tape. And I'm on one of those internet discussion groups with these sophisticated people. And this argument goes on that, well, if it's not on the tape, he never said it. But he did say it. That's why it's not on the tape, because the tapes have been altered. So this is kind of a high-tech operation for 1963. They were able to deal with the films, deal with the tapes, and basically re-edit the event as they had to. And in this case, they didn't. They took out surround the building. Now, here's the other thing. The next thing Chief Curry says, which is the first thing on the tape, is, have Parkland stand by. Well, that's interesting, because that's where they're going to go to have the operation. But it turns out Parkland is not the closest hospital. The closest hospital is Methodist Hospital. And it's a little bit closer. So nobody ever asked Chief Curry, because the Warren Commission attorneys, these guys, these legal eagles from, you know, Harvard and Yale, they don't know to look at a map of Dallas and say, oh, there's Methodist. They didn't ask him under oath, you know, what about Methodist Hospital? Did it ever occur to you that maybe you'd save a minute or two by going to Methodist? Well, anyway, the setup was at Parkland, and that's where they took President Kennedy.
Let's talk about Parkland Hospital for a bit. The big picture is that had the plan gone according to what the design was, they take JFK's up to surgery to perform, quote, life-saving surgery in order to remove the bullets
and get out and alter the wounds.
And had that happened that way, would you guess that we wouldn't be talking about this? Would that have been successful?
Oh, absolutely. Because what happens next is then they mournfully announce that I don't want to make this sound like everybody's involved, because everybody is not involved, but Dr. Kemp Clark would announce that President Kennedy had died during surgery, which was reported, by the way, as I said before, in the Dallas Morning News on the first page of the November 23rd edition. And then they turned the body over to the local forensic pathologist, who was an honorable man named Dr. Earl Rose, who was brought into Dallas in May 1963, unbeknownst to him for this purpose. They didn't have a medical examiner system prior to this. They had to set this up. And it would be turned over to him, and Rose would have performed an autopsy. It's not rocket science in a case like this. You take the body, you count the number of wounds. It's like medical carpentry. They say, okay, if the Dallas doctors reported accurately from the emergency room, their observations would be confirmed. Only they'd open up the body, and there's the entry at the front of the throat. They'd find the bullet inside. They do the autopsy on the head, which is you part the scalp, and you have to use a saw. You take off the head, you get into the brain, and they'd say, here's the entry wound, and that would be the end of it. There's the report that President Kennedy was shot twice or 3 times, how many times he was shot in the head from the front. And that's the end of it. And that's the medical legal best evidence of the diagram of the shooting. And there's no way in the world that Oswald could be the assassin. Of course, by that time, the whole plot's fallen apart because this whole thing turns on changing the diagram of the shooting to implicate Oswald's rifle in the assassination. That's what makes it look absolutely perfect case. And that's why the establishment and the Warren Commission says, well, we've got the autopsy evidence. Well, that's not the autopsy that would have occurred if there was no body alteration.
Right. So despite the things that went wrong in the assassination, there was still an effort when JFK got to Parkland Hospital. He was dead on arrival.
He was absolutely DOA.
Clint Hill has said publicly he knew he was gone. There was still an attempt to delay the death, the announcement that he was dead.
Not an attempt. They did it.
They delayed. They delayed the announcement.
They pretended he was alive.
Okay, because there was still thinking that they might be able to get him up to.
That was the plan, to get him up. And they had phony medical treatments because. Look, another way of stating it is this: is Paul O'Connor, the medical technician at Bethesda, put it this way to me, because by the time he gets the body that night, he said the cranium was empty, and he said, I don't believe they did it. This is Paul, who's very naive. In 1979, in my filmed interview with him, or 80, he says, I don't believe they did a tracheotomy in Parkland Hospital. I said, well, of course they did a tracheotomy at Parkland. I mean, to me, the issue is whether it was a little thing or a big one. He said, well, I don't think they did a trach. I said, why not, Paul? He says, well, you wouldn't do a tracheotomy on a man without a brain.
Exactly.
I mean, and other people have said, Pat Valentino put it this way: if you brought President Kennedy's body, as described at Bethesda, into any hospital, much less Parkland Hospital, you wouldn't do a tracheotomy. He's dead. So this whole business of, oh, he's really alive is nonsense. And the further evidence of the contrived nature of it, not only do you have this intubating the corpse, which, by the way, they use the Catholic excuse. I mean, I've spoken to these doctors, and I have this whole litany of what they thought and supposedly said. Well, he was Catholic, so they wanted to delay the pronouncement of death so they could have the last rites, and they always, they try to blame the victim. Only they bring in his religion this time. He's Catholic and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that was their excuse. Now, they also called for chest tubes. Now, the doctor, I spoke to an emergency room physician in the last month who said, okay, if a person needs a chest tube, you put in one chest tube. They had 2 chest tubes put in, one on the left and one on the right, to alleviate the breathing. There's only one problem with that, and it's a very serious problem. When the body gets to Bethesda Naval Hospital, the autopsy doctor reports that the chest tubes weren't pushed all the way in. They did not go beneath the epidermis. So it's superficial. You're supposed to push your chest tube all the way into the chest cavity. So this is make-believe stuff. So you have 2 doctors, one on each side, and I swear to God, if you could get in a time machine, I'd get them both before a grand jury and basically say, you want to go to jail or you want to tell the truth about what's going on here. One of them is still alive. The other one is passed on. I filmed them both. When I was with Dr. Jones in 1990, and I didn't have the full, I'm trying to remember what happened, but I pointed out to Jones on camera that the chest tube only didn't go beneath the skin. And he's head of surgery at Baylor or something. He says, I heard it pop. And I said to myself, well, maybe you heard somebody in the room, popping bubble gum or something, but it didn't go into the chest and didn't go in. And that tells me that both were part of the plot. When I say that, I don't mean they're architects or anything. Maybe they're giving some cock and bull story that President Kennedy's, I've thought of these stories they used. President Kennedy's trying to kill a foreign leader. He's trying to kill Castro. Maybe Castro will try to kill him. If anything happens, we have a national security. I've wondered about the stories given to the Dallas doctors to get them involved. And one of the things I think they might have told the doctors is that there's a standby team. If anything happens to Kennedy, he's going to be brought to your hospital and just follow directions because we have to have a look at him before, he's pronounced dead or something like that. But I'm trying to understand why, because I know I've met with Dr. Jones, met with him, had lunch with him, and filmed him. And when I finally understood that he didn't push the chest tube in, and I had that interaction with him, and he wasn't very happy about that. Peters was another example. He's became a well-known urologist. I don't think they devoted their lives to murder or anything like that. They were definitely, Peters especially, was a right-winger. One of them told me in 1966, Mr. Lifton, this is when I was a graduate student, calling him up on the phone and inquiring about the length of the tracheotomy incision. Tell me, is that Earl Warren, did they form this Warren Commission because the communist newspaper, the Daily Worker, said that, you know, Earl Warren should be investigating this? In other words, these guys were right-wingers. They grew up in Dallas, or they were in Dallas. They were in a right-wing community. They thought like right-wingers, and the anesthesiologist who had to know Kennedy's dead, he's an absolutely central figure in this, says to me at lunch with Pat Valentino that Kennedy was this president who let the boys down at the Bay of Pigs. So he was a political anesthesiologist. And his daughter, in 1980, she sees me with my book in a Hollywood function. She walks over to me, introduces herself. My daddy was in the room when President Kennedy died. I said, oh, who are you? What's your last name? And she said, she's a photographer, believe it or not. And she says, you shouldn't get too obsessed with this, David. And then she says to me, I just want you to know that on the anniversary of the assassination, my father and I drink champagne, or something like that.
Celebrating the death.
Yeah, that's the way it appeared to me. I mean, so this is the atmosphere of Dallas, and this is the nature of these doctors. And I think he was in this community where these doctors could be, in fact, recruited. And I think some of them were. And the central figure is Dr. The neurosurgeon, because he would have to do the hospital craniotomy. He would have to do the craniotomy.
And since that didn't happen at Parkland, it was critical that they get that body out of Dallas.
Absolutely.
Where they can, in fact, get to the brain, remove the bullets. So there's a confrontation at the front of the hospital.
At the hallway.
In the hallway.
Right.
Between the medical examiner who is insisting that that body needs to be in Dallas for a legitimate autopsy.
Right.
And the Secret Service agents who say, we're taking JFK back to Washington.
Right.
And guns are drawn.
Well, that's what I'm told. Yes, it's in the literature.
And they forced their way out of the hospital.
Absolutely, yeah, and yeah, they did.
So,
Orby Reich was traumatized. Orby Reich, the ambulance person, who was there with the O'Neill Funeral Home, was traumatized by this. He never forgot it. When I spoke to him for the first time in March 1980, he told me about this whole business. I had a first-person account of how frightened he was with men with drawn guns and this confrontation between the Secret Service and the Dallas authorities about getting that coffin out of there.
So since the alteration of the body didn't occur at Parkland, they had to do it sometime between the time it left Parkland and the time it arrived at Bethesda.
That's correct.
So should we continue? You want to let's talk about the body on load at Air Force One.
Okay, before we get to that, let me just say one other thing about Orby Reich. When I interviewed him in March 1980 on the telephone, and I interviewed him then in October on camera, and we'll get to the point you just made. I noticed that in a UPI story about Orby Reich is told to UPI on November 23rd. He was told to stand by his ambulance because they were taking another patient away from Parkland. And I said, what's that all about? And he said, well, they were going to move President Kennedy to another hospital. And I said, really? And this is on camera. I said to him, why? What did they say was the reason? I mean, I was holding my breath for what would come next. And he may have told me on the phone, but I don't think so. I think this came right out on camera, and I've never used it. It's in the, it's on the master film. He says, well, President Kennedy was Catholic, and they had no nuns here. Again, the Catholic excuse. They're bringing up, and here's Orby Reich, who's totally innocent, being told, he's 22 years old, he's being told, the president's going to be moved to another hospital because he's Catholic and there's no nuns at Parkland. Shows you how desperate these folks were getting, though. That was their plan B or C or D or whatever, to get that body out of there and get it to another hospital where they could do their little magic trick.
And since they couldn't get to the body to another hospital, they really started to fly by the seat of their pants, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
So at that point, I'm guessing they didn't have plan B. They were originating possibilities as the moments went by, I'm guessing.
I agree, John, because I think that these people were so arrogant that they didn't have a plan B and a plan C. I really think so, because you'd think that with all this planning they would have a plan B. They probably thought, how can anything go wrong? The driver is going to be driving slow. We've got our men camouflaged. I mean, we're just going to be able to take them out with one shot.
Yeah.
Who's going to ever think that everything can go to hell in a handbasket at Dealey Plaza, or that the seat is going to be pushed up at the... I mean, it's such a mess what happens, and to figure out this mess, you really got to look at this closely. It's taken me years. But you're right. Now they've got to figure out how we're going to get the body out of the coffin, because they've got to get it out of the coffin, and they better damn well do it in Dallas, because once you get back to Washington, D.C., basically you're in Bobby Kennedy's territory. He's the Attorney General of the United States.